Hello to everyone tuned in. This is episode one of the Godspeek podcast, hosted by the Arkon and The Greek. Over the next 10 episodes, you can expect to hear conversations on everything from ancient religions to the rise and fall of civilizations. So if that's the kind of thing that's of interest to you, then as your luck would have it, you're in the right place. We're going to be jumping into the first dedicated topic concerning those things and shed some light on some of the finer points. So, let's just make the introduction short and get straight to it. Godspeek has no political, religious, or corporate affiliations and is completely managed by myself, the Archon. So I hope you enjoy the show, and thanks again for listening. Hi there, Greek.
Hi there.
I hope that today's topic has some allure to it, because I remember you saying some months back, maybe 2 months back, that you wanted to talk about ancient civilizations and stuff like that. So the floor is going to be open to develop whatever lines of exposition you had in mind, unless your appetite has waned for that topic.
A little bit of both. If you look at current events, you wonder if people were ever aware of anything that came before them. And we're talking about on the Pope's work schedule, the late fall of 2020, right? And I think we haven't discussed what I mean by the Pope's work schedule, but if anyone asks you what time it is and you say anything between January and December or Monday through Friday, you're probably a de facto servant of the papacy. Whether you know it or not is irrelevant. That is taken as a serious fact, by the way.
For those who did listen to the last episode of Greek Speak podcast, they would have gotten some of the timekeeping references. So it's not exactly the first time, but yeah, I'm sure that we'll develop some of that as well on the Godspeak variant. But I think one of your most memorable quotes is, for me anyway, first in time is first in line. So I thought a good start to the series would be to look at some of the ancient settings that left an account of what the unseen realm is like. And so we'll be looking at how people in antiquity understood the supernatural and how that changed as history progressed. So let's start with the idea of ancient society in general, I think. Knowledge about the ancient world today is largely monopolized by academia and archaeologists, and the average person doesn't really have much of an interest in it, kind of what you alluded to. So as somebody who took it upon themselves to become learned in that ancient history, what have you found that ancient history or ancient orders can illuminate about high order subjects?
Well, let's start. Let's go right to the end of possible several or many episodes, and let's go to the end, and everything we talk about will be an infill. What goes around comes around, and if you look at the end of even this modern society, it is going to end up being of some cities, very few cities, but a scattered rural population that is basically agrarian. Think about that for a moment. That is basically the template for most ancient settings, right? Some cities and most of the population is scattered and agrarian in villages and towns. And this is how this modern society will end up as well. And I would even highly recommend that the consideration of any cities would be just a forethought and not a real thought. But that's another discussion. So let's just close the entire series of Godspeak or the podcast by just saying that. You'll end up being agrarian once again. What does that mean? Lack of heavily commercialized capitalistic industry. The industry that brings things to people as they require will not be heavily capitalized and industrial. It will be more locally produced. This is how things were back in the ancient times. Now, one can say, well, is the modern, let's say, example more progressive, or let's not in a political term, or is it more advanced? And I would suggest it isn't, because the quality of life has been sacrificed and diminished greatly. And it's very difficult for people to realize that because they have nothing else to contrast it with. But if you just have anyone reiterate what they consider to be challenges in life, it'll be self-evident that they have a fairly I should say, I'll just say very low quality of living generally. So when we go back to the ancient cultures, I should say, I think one could raise the question mark and say that they were aware of this, but chose for a higher quality life in most cases, even if it means living in a mud hut with a dirt floor. So this is kind of the contrast that I could set that we could probably end up finishing off with is that the contrast is a contrast of ideologies more than what we see being performed physically.
Mm.
Um,
But as far as being content to live within certain constraints in the ancient world, I mean, the people who were living in mud huts, I think, had to accept the state of affairs. I mean, if we sort of use the upper tier of those societies as the standard and look at the sort of the kings and the castles, people would say, well, you're saying that they chose to be like that, but surely they wouldn't have chosen to be without conveniences. The person living in a castle still wouldn't have access to any ready form of heating. He had to create a whole infrastructure just to keep himself warm during the winter. Whereas today we can just go out and get heaters. Surely they wouldn't have sacrificed convenience for whatever sublime higher order that they had at that point, which we don't have today.
To some degree, I would suggest that more and more there's more expose on how many of the amenities were that we enjoy here. I say we were also enjoyed by the Romans and the Greeks, and what we call Southwestern Asia or the Middle East and Asia, running water, central heating, things like that. They may not have done it the same way, but also the climate was different, and I believe that they had it optimized for their weather and climate at the time. Um, I think that if someone was living in malcontent with their mud hut and dirt floor, they could put their name on a waiting list of subscribing as a slave to someone who did have that, which was also very common. And people do that now. When you live in a city, you're called a resident, which is essentially political property. So, and you're registered at birth, and you have the birth certificate is exactly the same as any other commercial title. So just because you're not called a slave doesn't mean that you legally don't have that status. And I'm speaking to the people of the modern world. You hear it in art, and you hear it in passing. I feel like a slave or this or that. Well, it's because you really are legally. Um, Most people in the Western world, well, actually, most people on the planet are legally enslaved, meaning they're chattel property of some kind of fictional political body. Political juridical fiction is what you call a country. So it's really difficult to communicate the contrast regarding certain things because the certain things haven't changed. There's no contrast, for example, with a current person or human being living in the city and someone who was a slave living in a castle where the amenities were already provided. There's no legal difference between them. So I would suggest that the type of industry again that brings it makes it more popular, more conventional now, perhaps didn't exist similarly because of the quality would be diminished. So it was whether we provide it to everyone in low quality or just provide it to less than everyone with higher quality, and they
Okay.
opted usually for that.
And so I think most people today would equate quality with convenience. The idea that I can go and get the thing that fulfills a need that is immediate to me. But you seem to be speaking of a quality that's different.
Well, you could just look at what they call the grid, both the water municipalities, let's say, water, fresh water, sewer, and electricity. The quality of all of that is very, very low compared to the water that the ancients enjoyed and the electricity that the ancients enjoyed. The ancients enjoyed electricity as a fun demonstration. They didn't run power outlets and things like that. They were more agrarian. They didn't usually use the nighttime as people with an electrical grid do use. And that's another discussion perhaps with the electrical grid, but let's just, what's easier to contemplate perhaps is the water grid. Running water through straight pipes destroys the quality of the water, and also they're adding chemicals to it that are supposedly to prevent pathogens. Where if you look at the ancient cultures, they knew that the water had to move how water has to move in an undulating way. It had to be exposed to some air, some light, and it required more of a biological biogeometry or um, uh, let's say biomimicry in movement. Otherwise, the water would breed pathogens and be unhealthful to those that consumed it. This was very well known in all ancient cultures up until just a few hundred years ago. So again, with modern industry and the engineering, they could have opted for using those methods, but they opted not to because, again, the ideology of providing it fast, quick, and cheap, and you provide it as a convention to the populace, is negated by the engineering.
Mm. Well, do you see any sign of the gods approving of those kinds of societies and the way that they operated?
Yes, of course, and also the gods that are approved of this society, I would say, are more on the malevolent side, and it's a big subject, and one can say, well, the ancients with all their gods were just delusional, crazy, and ignorant, or we could just consider what has reached us today, what has been memorialized from back then is somewhat valid. And what you'll actually discover as we're talking about ancient civilizations or civilizations at large, this is another civilization, a parallel one, a society, if you will, of the unseen. So I think this is just a private commentary, but I think this entire series is futile to the average listener. And it'll be jam packed with very valuable information to those who understand the nature and reality of the gods, civilization, and society, and within the many levels that they have. So we can continue just speaking on the gods regarding various subjects if anyone has a firm grasp on it. But if you don't have a firm grasp on it, it might sound kind of elusive, and always try to plant what I say back down into being secular. And again, just to maybe, if we were to sum all this up, I'm going to say that it's the unseen that controls the seen, just as anything else.
No, I hear you. That's definitely something that we'll be highlighting more as time goes on. Another thing that I've noticed is that it was quite common for ancient societies to be explicitly tiered. Like you had the king at the top and the slave at the bottom, and then the aristocracy and the merchants and the workers in between. And the consensus seemed to be that those at the top were not only better off because they had more stuff, but they were better than the masses below them, period. Because, like, even in the Athenian democracy, the real majority were the slaves and the women and the children and the manual laborers, and those people were never held in high regard by their leaders or the elites. But in modern times, it's the opposite. Democracy is said to be king, and society is all about the people, and we're supposedly more humane and sophisticated as a result. Can you talk about what the fallacies in that kind of view might be?
Well, I'm not even going to touch that. I'll just say very simply, it's all deception. You're actually more enslaved, and let's say ideologically, legally, lawfully, in terms of your freedoms and liberties, you're far worse now than you ever have been. It's just that you don't know it. That's a huge subject to go on. Because a slave in ancient times knew he was a slave, where a slave today doesn't calls himself a citizen or a resident or a person or whatever. There are no free here. Let's just say it this way: from a lawful and legal perspective, the only free people that are left on Earth are maybe some people, the Pashtun tribes or of Afghanistan and northern Pakistan, um, the Turag people in southern Libya, northern Sahara, let's say. Uh, some of the people that live on some of the Polynesian islands, maybe some of the Inuit in the northern Canadian territories, and that's about it. I wouldn't say there are a million free people out of the 7.5 billion plus that are supposedly recorded by the World Bank. I wouldn't say that there's a million free people on the planet. I'd say it's probably a third of that, maybe less. And it's actually repugnant to see how ignorant people are regarding their status as beings. And on the other hand, it shows you how glorious those that control the earth, how brilliant they are in creating such a perception.
I do wonder what we might mean by freedom, though, because if we look at the ancient world, they were very brutal and didn't mind victimizing their neighbors. And so you could call yourself a free person back then, but if the Athenians march into your country and they try to take it and you try to negotiate with them, they'll just laugh at you and take it anyway. So is it really like to be a slave today, but to have access to the conveniences and some latitude of movement and action? Whereas if you're a Pashtun or a pygmy somewhere in, I don't know, Australia or living in the Sahara Desert, there are certain restrictions that are going to be imposed on you, even though you could call yourself a free person in the way that, say, an American might not. But what really is the practical difference if the American can get up and has this latitude of movement and action that perhaps some other people don't?
Whether the practical ones again are based on ideology, what do you find practical in your everyday life? Many free people, for example, will never be considered about losing their freedom. They never, or their rights. What they might be concerned about is being attacked, enslaved, or killed. But free people will never say we might lose. They're taking our rights away. That'll never happen. Only a slave can say that. Um, when you're limited that way, then that's why it's a matter of ideology. But for practical purposes, to be a free creature on the a surface-dwelling Earth inhabitant, you're an agrarian creature that is foraging, hunting, or producing food and clothing and shelter for most of your waking hours. That is basically the limitations of being a human. The industrialization and what we call in the modern sense the business people and the artists and the musicians and the philosophers and from ancient times or whatever that had a time to not do that every day were part of a society that just divvied up those tasks to a group of people, so the other group of people would be freed up from those so they can do other things. Um, and when you're in a non-industrial, when you don't, for example, setting where you don't have like the people that I mentioned, they're quite happy to each fend for themselves to a certain degree. They still have some industry, minor, meaning, cooperative things that one person will do. And the old idea of a baker, a blacksmith, or a basket weaver or a potter, of course, specialized trades can expand where people no longer have to consider doing those things where a specialized group will do them. But in the sense, the way it is done today, on let's say on a global level, is very different than the way it was considered then, because now the quality is not an issue. People think by buying quote unquote elite consumer goods like Ferraris or uh, diamonds or Gucci bags or whatever is a high quality item. It's not. That is a fashion trend. Um, and what I'm speaking of is the everyday quality of your food, clothing, and shelter. You see, is greatly diminished. I mean, if anyone knows about food, for example, try to find some on the market vegetables that are delicious and nutritious, or bread that is delicious and nutritious. Now, most people don't know, right? Because they're generations of a degrading state, or a wonderful water that when you drink it is refreshing and invigorating. Most people don't know that about that. There've been so many generations removed. When I say so many generations, at least minimum two, and anywhere between 4 to 10 generations removed from all of that. So again, I think the contrast here between the ancients and the current civilization, which I started off saying how this one will also end up like that, um, is not a matter of contrast because they're ancient and we're not. The contrast is qualitative. It's purely qualitative. Um, and it doesn't mean that if you go and live on a modern farm today, you're going to get quality either. As a matter of fact, most farmers, if you know any farmers anywhere in the world, they have a very, very high rate of death through toxic chemicals exposure, toxicity, and farming accidents. That's something to think about. So even the farming industry that's supposed to provide, is and the same with the water industry. There's people who work in the water industry that die of chemical poisoning and exposure. Just think about that.
Indeed, it's quite the indictment. Well, let's look at the broader picture of ancient empires and civilizations. I think Western society is very invested in the idea of Greece and Rome as the birthplace of their civilization, and most other empires, or at least ancient empires, fall into the shadow of that. Maybe ancient Persia or Egypt get mentioned because they interacted with the Greeks and the Romans a lot, or because of the biblical narrative. But beyond that, most people's knowledge of empires falls off pretty badly. In your studies, which empires have you come across that were noteworthy for their knowledge or technology or their achievements, aside from, say, the big four, big five: Egypt, Greece, Rome, Persia?
Well, here is another way to think about it. The ones that you mentioned are what academia is kind of flashing in front of everyone as how things are. There were many empires, for example, big and small, that each had their specialty. Like, for example, the Assyrian Empire from Nineveh, their specialty was war. When they needed something or wanted to develop something, they didn't do it themselves. They just simply conquered those who had already done it, right? So each one had their own specialty, and it was all based also around, it wasn't just a matter of business, it was based around their patron deity or matron deity. And it was basically the priests that had organized the laws and the rules from that patron or matron deity. Where, most people think of the Roman gods, for example, and what escapes them is that for most of, well, let's say for over 100 to 200 years, probably more than that, the official religion was Mithraism of Rome, which came from Persia. So, you can look at these were not standalone empires. They were more like geographical entities, if that's another way to say it. The standalone ones were the ones that had a radical difference in ideology, like, for example, the Parthians and the Seleucid Empire, which is not spoken of, which was actually larger than the Roman Empire in toto, but specifically not because they had subdivided kings and other, let's say, societies within that empire, which was basically Western Asia all the way up to Asia during the time of the height of Rome and the Greek empires. There are also empires, for example, in Northern Africa that were not Egyptian. Actually, you've heard of Hannibal, it was a big contrast between him and the Romans. So I think that the empires that we've been shown are not these stark contrasts, but they're more like geographical entities that cooperated to a certain degree and also warred to a certain degree.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, you've mentioned in the past a little bit about the Minoans and the Etruscans as people that might have done things that were noteworthy or maybe what they would call self-describe as heroic. And that kind of gets glossed over, I feel, also.
The Age of Heroes. It was an age, yeah. It was something that it was lasted long enough that what it was, and it was extreme enough to be noted as such. It was kind of like the nuclear age in modern times. Like you were not on the map unless you had detonated a big nuke or something, right? In modern times, right? Back in those days, if you didn't have a hero or someone like a demigod or someone that had supernatural powers that was born of a woman, you didn't make it to the map, and a lot of that has been erased. But fortunately, a lot of the Greek heroism and the Minoan and all that had been popularized before they could erase the rest. But most cultures did have their hero, even I should say, even now in Saturday morning cartoons still. So
I've noticed another interesting thing where if you treat the Middle East as the center of the world, which is not entirely unfounded to do, and you consider the Western world as what's west of the Middle East and the Eastern world as what's east of it, then you see a certain development where things become more secular and spiritually unrefined the more you go west, thanks to materialism and so called Abrahamic religions. And the further east you go, the more they preserve their indigenous culture and religions in spite of the Western cultural impositions in modern times. So the Chinese still have their Taoism and their Confucianism and their medicine and their Tai Chi, whilst many of the modern Greeks don't even know what their ancient martial art, pancration, is.
hmm
And the same goes for many European countries. What are your thoughts on that sort of discrepancy between the West and the East and how they preserve ancient knowledge?
Oh, how they preserve it? Well, again, it's whatever. If you get to the world dominion point, which is the post-Napoleonic era, it was what was decided. What card was played on the table, who will keep what. Because lest we forget that the communist era, what tried to the bringing in the advent of the communist era in the 20s, 30s, 40s, well, it's actually more like in the 40s and 50s, was to eliminate all of the ancient arts. And there was somewhat of a revival recently. So China has been drained. And also a comment, since I go by the Greek, Anyone who thinks that the Greeks living in Greece right now have anything to do with the ancient Greeks is severely deluded. Greece had gone through a cultural and brain drain over 2,000 years ago. There are no real ancient Greeks in Greece, as we say that. So the real Greeks versus the modern Greeks are everywhere else but Greece. So I just wanted to throw that in. And also the Eastern culture had their drain with communism. Even the Falun Gong and all that Tai Chi that's still uh, being heavily monitored and diluted. And what most Westerners consider to be ancient arts are heavily diluted. And that would be a discussion into the mystery schools or the occulted, secret societies. That's where those things are preserved. But I don't think there's any preservation under this world dominion principle that that the world has been experiencing for the past 200 to 300 years. I think it's just a matter of what's been allowed. The world has been divided by a small group of people, and they just review each geographical section and culture and supposed nation state and say what will allow them to maintain or not. So this is way down the line. This is in terms of what's been preserved. It's like having a bowl of soup and dumping it into a lake, and just because you dump the bowl of soup into the lake, that lake is now soup. Not really. It's so diluted it doesn't resemble a bowl of soup anymore.
I hear what you're saying. I kind of, well, with preservation, I think there's also the geographical aspect of when you look at European countries, there's so much migration that's taken place within Europe that it's a completely different continent from like half millennia to half millennia. Whereas if you look at the Chinese, they've been pretty consistent in being able to maintain their hold on that area for 2,000 plus years and maintain a culture that even though it's diluted at this point still has some vestiges of things that you can research and find useful stuff there, wouldn't you say?
Actually, I would say no. Not in the open. Yes, if you were to search hard enough, not in the open. It would be tucked away. Yeah, but it wouldn't be overt.
Okay. Well, that's still, I'd say something that surpasses a lot of stuff that you can find in the West, where if you dig for ages, it's hard to come across things that are sublime. Okay, so on one hand, we have empires, and then on the other hand, we have civilizations, and the two are different, right? So, like, empires seek to expand and absorb the jurisdiction of other nations into themselves, and civilizations generally don't. So, when you compare ancient empires like the Assyrians, who were expansive, versus, say, the Etruscans, who they fought the Greeks and the Romans, but they weren't a conquering people. Do you find that empires versus civilizations had any distinction in their accomplishments or knowledge?
I think that is a cosmic turning point. In other words, each age is delineated, each large swath of time. Well, let's just say from 50 to 100 years to 1,000 years at a time, even 400 years at a time. You'll notice that there are cycles that 20-year, 40-year, 80-year, 250-year, 400-year, 1,000-year cycles that societies, empires, and civilizations go through. And I think you'll know what the gods are deciding to do when these things change. When there's an empire formed where there wasn't, and where there an empire was and now there isn't. It's basically what's been deemed to be done, let's say, cosmically or non-secularly first. So we're just seeing the results of it, unless you understand what's called prophecy, where these things are talked about before they happen. Um, no, I think that if you look at, you can do. I haven't done this in a while, but anyone can go on the stupid rectangle, the internet, the computer, and put in ancient civilizations no one has ever heard of, or unknown ancient societies, or non-popular ancient societies, or again ancient civilizations no one has heard of. There's probably websites that list some of them, and you'll look around, and the thing is, they don't actually do any work for you. You're gonna have to do the work on your own. Like I know if you study, for example, the civilization of, well, it's considered Greek. There were islands off of Greece, the Cycladian. Look up Cycladian art, however you want to spell it, with a C or a K. The Cycladian art, and you'll see like stuff that should be in MoMA or the Met, like super ultra modern art sculpture, right? And this is thousands of years ago. And then there are other, I think the Vake or Vivke culture in northern Germany, what's known as northern Germany, northern Europe right now, that had similar artwork at the similar time. So they really stretched far and wide, and they even South American art that looks very similar at that time. So were they an empire? That type of ideology and art had been found at that time all over the world, or were they just a civilization? I think imperialism is a show of force, which back then would have been armies and navies that can travel in mass and attack from a distance and up close. Like, for example, an example of empire today is an aircraft carrier. An aircraft carrier is a totally useless piece of tactical equipment. It's only used with certain strategies. It's to show colonial power or imperial power. Because it's been shown in war games, for example, that you could take out, and there's no such thing as an aircraft carrier, by the way, and not that the actual ship doesn't exist, but it's always a carrier group. It needs several destroyers and frigates to protect it and fuel it and support it. But it's been commonly shown that that can be eliminated with just a Silkworm missile and a few speedboats very, very quickly and effectively. So basically, was this true also in ancient times? Yes. They had very large, cumbersome armies. All you had to do was inflict a pandemic on them or cut off some of their supply lines, and instead of having 30,000 or 20,000 forward marching troops, you've got a mob of 20,000 or 30,000 people. That's why the Romans very often did what's called decimation. If they didn't obey or they lost a battle, the surviving group, one out of 10 men were killed, as the word decim denotes 1 out of 10, as a punishment. So I don't know if there's a definitive point between civilization and empire, other than one boasts to have strength over others and the other doesn't, would be one way to think of it.
I see what you're saying, and I mean, if you're a nation that isn't striving to expand and be belligerent in that kind of way, then perhaps that does create a sort of incubation for more subtle arts and cultural expressions that, if you're always trying to go to war with people, might not come forth, I guess. But in terms of knowledge of the supernatural, if let's say we shift the focus from art and culture to knowledge of the gods, were there certain ancient empires or civilizations that you would say were more sublime and advanced in that aspect as far as interfacing with the gods?
Sure. Well, you could take the story of Troy. I believe Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter to set the ships a sail because there was no wind. And you could go on and on and on about that. It's still done today, by the way. It might be a shocker to most people, but for example, when the American military launches a campaign, they do sacrifices as well, human sacrifices. It's not done publicly, and it's guarded that this information doesn't go out. And then the sacrifices continue, but with the civilians that they usually attack. And this goes with any modern army. In most cases, I would suggest that even the Asians partake in that. The kamikaze in Japan were actually human sacrifice to evoke war gods. It wasn't because they didn't have the technology to fly something into an American ship. They had to also sacrifice a very well-abled fighting soldier.
Yes, I've heard a lot of accounts of this, that there were certain battles that were lost in the middle of the 20th century because they would summon storms and it would wipe out the opposing fleet or army.
Right, or there are gods for disease, for famine, for battle gains and losses. There's a god for everything. Take your choice. And there are people still alive today that are well versed in that. But in another way, people themselves, if they understand the forces and the energies behind what the gods use, can actually work in that realm, of course, in a minor way, but also influence outcomes without going to the gods. But typically, the gods are the fastest and easiest way to do barter and have control, is have someone else, more senior to you, I should say, in ability, do it.
And it does seem to be the case that for most cultures, there's a key or some type of catalyst in human sacrifice that really does jumpstart this activity within the spiritual realm that really get the gods to do stuff for you. Do you ever see empires or civilizations that were able to access that same power without the human sacrifice component?
Unknown, unknown, because it would have to be closely examined, and you'd have to have behind the scenes information, direct information, because it's very subtle. What I mean by very subtle, meaning that they might say they're doing this and that, and they have this wonderful tactic or whatever or strategy, but behind the scenes, there still is a human sacrifice.
Right. Okay. Part of the reason I'm asking this stuff is to see how much one can read out of the fact that some of the ancient empires seemed more apt to conquer than others, and I wonder whether, say, the Greeks or the Persians, who ruled over some of the largest areas, had a particular favor or ordinance from their gods that was unusual. Because otherwise, why couldn't anybody just rise up and conquer the whole continents? I don't think the Indian empires ever did that, for example.
They did, but they had a different ideology. Remember, the ideology is basically greed, like the Sun Tzu principle. The reason there's conflict and war is because of personal gain, a desire for personal gain. But once you get what you thought you wanted, or you actually achieved it, you realize that it's very expensive to maintain. So certain cultures had the wisdom to understand that conquering was not all that it was, advertised to be. It's very expensive.
That's a good point. We talked about it a little before, but I just want to wrap up this point in terms of technological advances. Since modern people seem to think that they're special in that regard, can you talk about some of the inventions and or developments of ancient times that might have indicated a superior understanding of things? Because I've come across a lot of books that will lay out things that were invented in the ancient world that clearly don't exist, like even a shade of those things anymore. And there's a lot of knowledge concerning things like chemistry in particular, I think, with like poisons and antidotes and warfare tools like Greek fire, where they've just completely disappeared. And so, could you name a few things that you've come across that you thought were noteworthy?
I think those would probably be the best, and also how to deal with the entities known as the gods again. Give you an example in a minor way. You could look this up on the internet searches. There was a group studying paranormal activity and tribalism, and they had gone to Vietnam fairly, well, I shouldn't say recently, maybe 30, 40 years ago, and they found some people living in the villages that were able to summon demons or entities that would protect them in the forest, and nothing could harm them. Meaning, like if, let's say, for example, it's just, and I think this example is given during the American War, the Vietnam War there, these tribal people would just walk right through a firefight and not get hurt by any of the projectiles or bullets or fire bombs or anything, where those that didn't have this protection were hurt or affected. And you could just research, tribal demons summoning in Vietnam. And there's actually, the reason I'm mentioning this is because it's an academic group that went out and did the research on this. And these, let's say, Vietnamese medicine men in the jungle were able to summon a spiritual entity that would give them protection or harm those that they wanted harmed. And this, again, the reason I'm citing this is because it was a study done by an academic group, right? If that gives it any validity, and it's actually published online, just research it. Or I don't have any specifics other than that. So if it can be done by these, let's say jungle people in Vietnam, because they literally are jungle people, they live in the jungle, the deep jungle, away from everyone. It doesn't mean that it can't be more metropolitan. It could not have, in other words, I would say that this type of spiritual access and protection and power can be gained whether you're in the jungle or in the city by any culture, right? So ultimately, that it would be the ultimate super weapon. Um, and the stuff that you mentioned, the mechanistic stuff and the chemical stuff, I think is even more developed today to a certain degree because of the focus and more people on it, and also carryover from ancient times. I would be very, a caveat would be that if they tell you no one knows how it was done is just a cover up and people accept it, it's plausible, right? I mean, I've even said that before. I've working around people with trade secrets, and they would ask me, "You worked with such a person, you know how he did that?" I says, "I really don't know." Instead of saying, "Well, I do know, but I can't tell you," right? Uh, they're both plausible, but saying I really don't know is far more plausible. Look at politicians. I can't recall, or when they're at hearings, right? That's plausible. That's fine. I can't recall. What are you going to do? Well, torture is one way to get it out of them, but anyway.
Yeah, I think it's interesting this thing where the people that still have access to this technology or tradition of evoking the gods, I kind of feel like the corporations that do it or the governments that do it, they always have to hide and do it in secret and make it this almost like a burdensome thing that you have to commit to the secret society, otherwise you can't get it. But if you go and talk to the jungle people, they'll do it right in front of you sometimes.
Well, the
It's
corporate
weird.
and the government people will do it in front of you also, depending on who you are, but they won't go on CNN and do it. Let's just
Okay.
say this. I've seen certain corporate people show me things that shouldn't be, right? I'm not going to mention, Halliburton or anything like that.
Hmm. But then there's also this aspect of the people that can do those things. It almost seems like they have a limitation, at least socially, in how they move. Like I remember seeing a documentary about Qigong in China, and there's these people that do Qigong healing, and the extent to which they do it, it has to be called supernatural to the secular mind. But the guys who do it are always tied down to this tradition of no, you can't take it out of your region, or you can't take it out of the country, or you can't talk to the Westerners about it. And if you do, you'll be cursed or something.
Well, yeah, there's let's just look at it very specifically. If you're dealing with a particular entity, that particular entity is a singular, let's say, quote unquote, individual. Uh, and most individuals, whether they're human or not, or gods, focus on, I say most, focus on one action at a time. Like we're doing this podcast right now. Could you be watching TV, playing a video game, and having another conversation at the same time? And the answer is possibly, it'd be very difficult, or no. So if you're dealing with the supernatural world, you'd probably want to monopolize it or with that entity just to get quote unquote undivided attention. Because most of these deities and entities or gods are not omniscient and omnipresent. We're still talking about like what's called the second heaven. These are we're not talking about the God of the gods, which can be at all places at all times, which is I don't think we've touched on. We're talking now. This is going to be a surprise to many people that the realm of the gods is such a realm. But if you were to go into that realm and coexist with them, and ask them, "Do you have a god?" They would say, "Yes, we do have gods," and there would be in another realm, right? So this is, I think, that needs to be touched on as well sometime here.
Yeah, certainly we will do that. That's reserved for a future episode, but it doesn't hurt to tease it out at an earlier point, like now. But okay, let's keep it going and look at some of the religious aspects of the ancient world. I think the earliest civilization is often claimed to be the Sumerians at around 3000 BC, although the Danube Valley civilization does predate that at around 5000 to 4000. How far back can we go in search of accounts stating that mankind is ruled by a society of gods in another realm or from another realm? Because I don't think that it's so much a religion as it was the only known paradigm for understanding anything until at least the Middle Ages.
Well, here's the thing. I have a personal peeve about how old something is or how far back you can, because ultimately, when you try to think in a higher state, you see everything happening at the same time. In other words, even if you're studying something that's ancient, let's say just say 3,000 years ago or 5,000 or 10,000 years ago, let's say, you're dealing with it in the present. Let's say you have a lot of information or a little bit of information of a society from 10,000 years ago, let's say. You're dealing with it in the present state. Now, how you're dealing with it is, well, can I borrow anything and use it now, or I'm just I have to go tell someone else about this, or I'm a historian, or however, or I want to look at their art or their military, or whatever. You're dealing with it in the present. So how long ago they were is not as important as how you can how you're dealing with them in the present. The only time I think that how long ago they were is important is if you're trying to create historicity, a timeline. But most people don't do that. You go to a historian for that, and I wouldn't think they're accurate at all at best. Uh, so I would say as far back as you can go, And if you have a working knowledge of what you're looking for to get from them, you will eventually figure out really how far back they were or not, unless they're completely hidden.
Well, I mean, the Proto-Indo-Europeans, as they're called, are often cited as the earliest European culture from fourth millennium BC-ish. When I look at the Proto-Indo-European gods, as at least as they're put forth by archaeology, I'm wondering if that is perhaps the earliest pantheon that we can point to, or at least one of the earliest, since many of those types of deities seem to occur in later civilizations. We have things like the overarching sky god called, I'm going to butcher their names, but Deus Pater, to anglicize the pronunciation. And that becomes the archetype for Zeus or Jupiter, or the Hausos, the dawn goddess that the Greeks seem to call Eos and the Saxons called Oster, right? Or the divine twins motif, or the sun and moon gods. Like, what's your takeaway from those kinds of archetypes?
Well, those archetypes are like the politicians of their day. They were all geographically bound. You'll get a very deep sense that they have. There's some, we'll call it cosmic geography, or the Earth has been divvied up and dedicated to certain deities and entities that the people people discovered, or the entities just came, out of the woods or out of the desert and said, "Hey, here I am. This is who I am." You know, I think that it's geographical. In other words, let's just take Zeus for example. There is no overarching Zeus over the whole planet. It was strictly limited to that geography because there were concurrent other gods at the same time in other places. And we're speaking of gods now in the first heavenly realm, or the second heaven as defined, let's say, or the realm of the gods, the general gods, not their god. So again, I just want to bring that up because people have to remember it's not as simple as you've been shown on Saturday morning cartoons or church, or even as academia or religion puts it out. Because, here's another thing I need to put in. Whenever we're talking about gods, I think you mentioned this also, there's no religious affiliation here. And if one is going to consider anything when they hear the word religion, the word religion is that it is a state entity. In other words, all modern religions and even ancient religions are state entities. The reason you know about quote unquote religion or in the gods, or how little you know about them, is because it is allowed by the state. And what do you know about the modern state, right? So that's why when it comes to, look at the American culture and God we trust. I mean, whoa, that is such a ridiculous statement. I mean, which God are you talking about, right? And what does it even mean? It's meaningless to say that. It's, for example, when you walk around in the world today, it doesn't matter what language. They don't really say this in Asia. In Asia, they say the power of the heavens, but they ask people if you believe in God. That is the most ridiculous question I've ever heard. Which one? There's such a multitude and diversity. Just to say, do you believe in God, and to take it presumptively that you're talking about the Most High God is also ridiculous, because there is another specific, whole specific ideology leaning towards that, or him, I should say. So I just wanted to toss that in there if that helps at all.
Yeah, of course it does. And just to develop it a little bit more as far as the interplay that exists between the human society and the society of the gods, on one hand, the ancient cultures understood the primacy of the gods, but I think that by the time ancient Greece becomes a dominant power, and possibly before, we're already seeing some version of so-called atheism present itself in their literature, where, like, the sophists were notorious for that, and so was the philosopher Epicurus. So what are we to make of the fact that even though ancient cultures profess to believe in the gods, as early as the first millennium BC, it's evident that the gods are almost becoming like an obligatory tradition or like a far off abstraction?
Well, in order to deny something, you have to establish that it exists first. You can't deny something that doesn't exist. That's the interesting thing about atheism, but which is another religion. Again, it's a state religion, and most atheists are very religious because they ask for justice, which is the ancient goddess, Justitia. So we're talking about also serious mental disorders with your average human. But I would suggest that the if you study the sophists and the philosophers of that time, especially when the brain drain happened and they all went over to Rome, like people think Plato and all these guys were Greek. They weren't. I mean, they were everywhere but Greece, India, Sicily, places like that. But anyway, if you didn't bring a lamb to the local whatever state office as a sacrifice to Hercules, you were fined. I mean, how do you put that in context?
That it's there's an administrative aspect of you just have to do blah 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 whether you believe in it or not.
And it is totally and completely acceptable that the humans use secularly, the demands on the society through in the name of their gods to gain for themselves. So, for example, if you were fined if you didn't bring a lamb on Sunday to be sacrificed to Hercules by the state in Rome, if you didn't do that, you were fined. And the people that were levying the fines and accepting those lambs didn't believe in Hercules at all. On a higher level, that was actually still approved by those gods, because if it wasn't, it would be stopped.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. It's something that I've wondered a lot because you see these representations of certain gods that are put forth, and you don't even really know if that god is still alive.
Right.
Like is Hercules the one who was saying sacrifice to Hercules, or is it some other god that's saying that?
Some other priest, whatever, that had direction or dictate from another god. Remember, by that time, also Greece. Well, this is more like Rome was in full on. The official religion was Mithraism, which came out of Persia. So it's sort of complicated. It's sort of as complicated as and not as today in modern politics. Everyone's wants to spread democracy, right? It doesn't mean it's a meaningless term, but it still catches people ears in minds. Like, for example, one of the most oppressive states that exists today is known in the Western world as North Korea. Well, North Korea is defined as the Democratic Republic of North Korea. So these things become meaningless, but they do exist and they do function with certain terminology. But there is a cosmic being behind that. Let's just sum it up for people again, because if you look at civilizations as having a life of their own, studying ancient civilizations, is it a living civilization, meaning is it functioning as such, or is it a past one that is dead and no longer functioning as that? You see, so like we could say today, there are no ancient civilizations that we know of that are functioning on an imperial level. But you could say a lot of the Western world uses civil Roman law out of Rome, and they're using the time that the Vatican uses. But are they adherent to everything else? And the answer is no. And the same was also back then. You could look at the conquest of Judea by Rome. They still used a lot of their laws. In most cases, they're minor laws, not nationwide laws, because they were conquered by Rome, and they functioned accordingly as any other Roman or colony would have, with certain exceptions. In the State Department, they call it an area book. If you're working in a diplomatic capacity and you're going to be sent to a country, they give you what's called an area book, and it has the lists of the customs and traditions of the people, so you're familiar, so you don't go there and offend someone, right? Because something that's commonly accepted in one culture is not accepted in another. It could be a death offense in some other cultures. So you have to know the areas, but I'd say that it's been blurred and obscured always, but because that's just the way that humans roll. Humans don't want accuracy or intelligent conversation or to consider things with precision. I also want to make a correction. I said Plato earlier. I meant Pythagoras, who wasn't Greek, right? Basically, he spent very little time in Greece, but I said Plato, I think I recall, and I meant Pythagoras, right? Who studied in the East and went everywhere but Greece, pretty much.
Okay, so we'll look at one more topic before wrapping up, which is that of mystery schools and secret societies. So let's start with the mystery school aspect. I'm just going to give a little exposition to set up my understanding, and then I'm going to ask you to elaborate. Because I recently heard a lecture where someone elaborated on what he called the great, quote unquote, the great shift. So it's a familiar theme in esoteric lore that mankind is living in a fallen or regressed state because he doesn't have open access to the supernatural. So even if there are gods, then we clearly aren't close to them anymore. But at one point in history, things were different because man was in a spiritual golden age where everyone knew how to properly interface with the gods. So the great shift was the pivot away from that, where quote unquote religion suddenly became a thing where you don't have direct knowledge based on experience. So you have to believe in the gods. Because if you believe in something, it's because you can't see it or you don't know about it. But if you're actually directly living it, then you don't need belief. So when open access to the supernatural reality was taken away, mankind now has to rely on the priestly class to go and get the information from the quote unquote other side through certain rituals or whatever, and then transmit it back to the public. And that's still the age that we're living in. But it seems to me that mystery schools developed from this dynamic where the gods at some point would only speak through chosen representatives who then wanted to keep things secret, and so you get these cults. Do you recognize that idea? Do you know when it happened? Can you add anything
It's
to that exposition?
it's valid. I would say that that would have happened, in other words, out of public view overtly around the time of Hezekiah, if you want to pin it back into using the Judean geographical historical time. So what would that be, about 600 BC, around the axial time? I would suggest around 600 BC is when it would kind of faded away out of public view. In other words, the direct interaction. Not to say that there were no priests still interceding for mankind, which is what the gods demanded, because you had to be prepared a certain way, right? It's just like, for example, football, right? Just because you like to play football, you can't go to the Super Bowl and jump on the field. You'll be, escorted off or dragged off and beaten up by the crowd because you're not part of that elite group to play that game at that time. So you always had certain times where certain elite groups, it took a lifetime of preparation and genealogy to get to. So those things have to be considered as well. But in terms of public view, I think around 600 BC is when things started going dark with the gods. It doesn't mean that they're not still in effect. And the only part of what you said I don't agree with is the fallen state. I don't think man is in a fallen state at all. I think man is in a negatively influenced and oppressed state, but not fallen. No.
Yeah, no, I wasn't saying it. I'm just saying it's a part of esoteric lore. So like the mystery schools and the Gnostics, whatever, they go
That's
with that.
Yeah, the Gnostics are, I wouldn't listen to anything that they put out. You'd be familiar with it because you're going to come across. The Gnostics were like if anyone remembers in school, and if you were, I'm sorry, I was too, the child that no one wanted to play games or didn't want to include in their team sports, right? And you get enough of those children that the rest don't want to include. They form their own little group. Yeah, the Gnostics were basically a spin-off group that were not entitled to go into the higher levels of what was established as deific knowledge and ceremony, and they went out and started their own little thing. But it's yeah, very simple to see that.
But as far as the timeline goes, I guess I was also referring to this notion of not just going through priests to get to the gods, but let's say if you look at at least the lore that exists, because that's really all that we have of pre-flood times, there seems to be this idea that at some point you didn't even need the priest. Like it was just the
Right.
god is right there, go talk to him, or you know how to do the sacrifice to summon whomever and just do whatever.
Well, it was a question of whether the population was slim enough that it was afforded by the gods to do that, because people were far and few in between. And they usually, if you were in a cosmopolitan setting, they pulled you out of that setting and pulled you out into a rural setting to communicate with you or call you out.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean that's a point that I did want to touch on because even though they're called mystery schools, they weren't really mysteries in ancient times because everyone knew that Egypt was a center for supernatural information, and that's why someone like Pythagoras went there. And so I did want to ask about this idea that you had these quote unquote mages or wizards or whomever that were, highly esteemed, and they seem to move around from place to place and never really settle into the city. And I'm kind of wondering where that archetype comes from. And you're kind of mentioning it there.
The cities were never considered a hub for anything other than what cities are known for today. In other words, nothing ever came out of a city that was considered the city was the place to be. It was places of it was a center focal point where you came and did whatever you did well, and then you left. But typically, you would have a god over that city also. But once you had the god over that city, they already had their liturgy and whatever they had going on. But to be called on by other gods and to again, it's a complex situation. Like for example, cities are usually dedicated to a god. When people just cities in many cases just didn't form organically, or because a lot of people wanted to be in one place and they said now it's a city. They actually developed cities before there were cities. They were there was forethought into it and dedication to a certain god. So I might want to retract that you always had to be dealt in a rural setting. I'm just saying in many annals, you'll find that people were pulled out of the gatherings, of large groups of people to be alone with an entity, right?
Yeah, I follow you. Touching on what I was asking before, it seemed as if everybody knew about things like the mysteries of Isis or Orpheus or whatever, or Delphi. It's just that if you wanted to join them, you had to meet certain criteria. So, when did the mystery schools become this version of secret societies that we see now that are explicitly deceptive and obfuscate their presence? Whereas I don't think they really did that as much before in the past.
I think they did. If you go and study things that were written by philosophers even 2,000 years ago, they always talked about things being done in secret. Just anyone could access what was, let's say, memorialized in what they call the Bible. The high priest entered into the most sacred place, the Holy of Holies. It was, even though specifications were given in the Bible, we don't know what would happen in there specifically, other than the generality that a high priest goes in at a certain time of year and does these things. But the rest we don't know. You have to look at what they call apocryphal works, what would be like I call fire station writings, because when you were a priest, you didn't go to work in the morning, come home at night. You stayed there for days on end like a fireman would, right? You go to work on a Monday and you leave on a Thursday. You sleep there, you live there, you eat there, you wash there, and you wrote down annals or oral traditions, Book of Enoch, Book of the Upright, Book of Jasher, right? Things like that. Not to be, to be considered. Those writings should be considered. Everything should be considered, but you should do it with discernment.
Mm. Yeah, I just have one more question and then we'll wrap up. Um, Sort of, I guess, ending off on this mage topic again. When we talk about some of the prominent mages of all time, I mean, obviously a lot of stuff is lost, but you'll typically get things like Pythagoras come up, or even the Persian magi might come to mind. But in spite of those people's supernatural awareness, you don't really hear about ancient mages or grandmasters rising up to seize power and conquer nations. It's always the king or military leader who kind of does that. And yet somehow that guy, the military guy, always seems to have an inferior understanding of the supernatural than his priests or his magicians. Do you know why those who had the most sublime knowledge were historically satisfied to either be advisors or just have their little groups or be outcasts rather than conquerors?
Well, that's like the inheritance of the firstborn. It never really works out that way in certain writings. There's the desire for the philosopher king that never really happened, other than maybe Solomon, maybe. Yeah, but no, the desire for a philosopher king, which has been put out from the time of ancient Greece, having a wise king, but more than just wisdom, but a working knowledge of the gods and everything that would affect his ability to rule over people. There's a saying that the Creator puts the most basest of men over people. Well, he doesn't think much about human society. Here's the thing also about going back to the people once dealt with the gods and now they're not. Once you understand the setting of humanity, let's say for several ages to be in a fairly pathetic state, and you accept that, I mean, the only request you would have for a god that had the wherewithal to do so is to remove you from the earth. Think about that for a minute. That would be the most paramount request. If the setting has been established to be fairly pathetic and deplorable, wouldn't you want to just be pulled? I mean, if you fell into a sewer, wouldn't your only thought would be to call someone to come and pull you out if you couldn't climb out on your own? So that's pretty much the setting that we've been in, meaning we, humanity, for millennia. So the only valid request, other than making your life food, clothing, and shelter, and whatever else you might desire according to whatever God you worship's will, would be to remove you from this setting until, you know, this, either to another place or until, and put you back, or you know, or protect you actually from the setting on the earth. And only the most well-learned people would make such a request. If you think that things could be made better here as they are, and you have wants that are superior to being removed from the earth because of its pathetic state, you're not well learned, and I could say that with great confidence.
But there is this idea, though, of being, you said sewer, I think, right? Like if you fell into the sewer,
Right.
you could still be king of the sewer, though. I think like Spider-Man, you have this, I forget, is it the lizard who just runs the sewers and all the beasts there do what he tells them to do?
Right.
Like
And
so,
that's what the leaders of the world are, kings of the sewer. That's right. Look at all your politicians and kings and whatever, as far back as you want to go, they're ruling over sewer rats in terms of qualitative. And a sewer is defined as a place where waste is dumped onto, right? What's discarded. And also many of the gods are discarded, and many of the spirits and many of the things that people find important are actually discarded things. Again, there is a world dominion system that's been in place very fervently and very definitely. It's not a deep state, by the way. There's no such thing as people use today. There's no such, that's something that's put out by them as a diversion tactic. There's groups of people that are actually led by non-people, the non-humans that rule this planet through people, and they've got everyone believing whatever they want to believe. So there's a certain amount of passiveness and calm until it gets too quote unquote expensive or too time consuming or not worth the effort to make a big change. That's why you see right now what they call the end of 2020 on the Pope's work schedule. What is happening and what will be happening in the near future is because it's just not necessary to keep this delusion and deception that's been going on for the past 300 or 400 years since the Renaissance. Really, it's not necessary anymore. It's time for a change, but it's not going to work out the way they think it's going to work out anyway. So that's another discussion.
yeah, and I think that makes for a good rounding off point as far as, yeah, there are things in the future that have to be elaborated, and perhaps we can do that in subsequent episodes. So yeah, unless there's anything that you want to wrap up with, I think I'm good. I got all my questions off my chest.
Oh, that's fine. I spent my whole life unwrapping. So yeah, I'm getting into the what the cover, the thin veil is, and I hope others do as well. No pun intended. So, all right, till the next time then. Thanks. We'll do it again.
Yeah, and to everybody who tuned in, thanks again for listening. We'll be back at the next episode with some other topic to dig into. Until the next time.